Now we're going to move on to talking about aperture. So aperture is controlled inside of the lens that you bolt onto your camera. For example, you'll see on the front of the camera that you'll have f numbers. If you see here, this has got an aperture of f3.5 to f5.6. So that means when you're taking a photo, your aperture can open up to a range of 3.5 at its widest, or when you zoom in on this lens to 55mm, you get an aperture of 5.6. That is the amount of light that is coming into the sensor, and it is also calculating the amount of focus that is on that image, or what is also known as the depth of field. It's the extent of what area of that photo is purely in focus, or if everything's slightly blurred out in the background. To explain this a little bit better, what I want to show you here, this is one of my 50mm lenses. This has got an aperture of f1.2. That means when you use this lens, you can open your aperture right up, so it means it's letting the most amount of light in. However, it means that there's a very, very minute amount of the photo that is actually going to be in focus. When you wind the aperture down and you close that light down, you let less light into the camera, but you also extend the amount of the image that is in focus. So that means that if you wanted to get a landscape scene where everything's in focus, you would want to look to shoot more like the f16, even f22, to make sure the whole of that image is purely in focus and you get all the detail of the trees, the foreground, the background, the sky, everything. If you're trying to go for something a bit more artistic, let's say like with my hand out here, that is just going to focus directly onto my hand, you can see the rest of the image is completely out of focus. That is where you can then use an aperture that is wide open. This is obviously why lenses get so expensive, and this is why often that people say don't invest in cameras, invest into lenses. For example, this lens here is about, I think when I paid for it, about £1,200. But this allows me to shoot at a set focal length. However, it allows me to shoot at an aperture at f1.2. So if I'm being really creative, I can get a really shallow depth of field. I can get just the tiniest minute bit in focus. However, you have to be a little bit of a ninja to get it pin sharp. Like I said, we're talking millimeters of focus here. If you're trying to get a good exposure on your model and you're also trying to get most of it in focus and make sure that you get a crisp image, you're always going to want to shoot roughly f2.8, something like that. That will give you a really good crisp image, and it makes sure that you've got a little bit more depth to play with. That, let's say for example you focused on the nose, realistically the eyes are going to still be in fairly good focus. When you go around to f8, the nose will be in focus, the ears will be in focus, and whatever the subject is behind them will be in focus, and you'll get a very crisp image. So the aperture allows you to be a little bit more creative, and it also just allows you to manipulate the light a little bit more. The reason why prime lenses like that 50mm and something like the 35, and they also do 85s and various other lenses, you may only have a fixed focal length, so that means you can only shoot at a range of 50mm. You can't, if you want to zoom in or out, you have to walk backwards or forwards. But what this allows you to do is then get more ambient light into the shot and get a brighter image when it's a little bit darker. This is why these lenses are so valuable, and also once you've invested into them, you'll realise just why they are so good. Many professional photographers will have prime lenses purely for the ability to shoot with a wider open aperture and also just get that fixed focal length look. It is something that a lot of people always regard as like being a higher end look, but however that does not mean that if you get a zoom lens which is a 70 to 200 or a 24 to 70 you won't get an incredible look. Those lenses just give you a slightly different look and allow you to just play around with different apertures. On this picture here you can see that I've shot with a lower aperture. That means that the background's really out of focus. I've got the lighting on the model, it's made the image a bit brighter because I've been able to push the exposure open a little bit more to get a different type of shot. But you'll also see what is called bokeh. That is basically where the circular elements of the lens are, where the photo is out of focus in the background because you're focusing on just that one part of the photo. That means that all of the elements in the background will get this soft circular blur. When you then obviously turn the aperture round to a darker shot, you'll see that everything's in focus and you lose that. And that is what is called bokeh. When you shoot with an aperture of say f1.2, so much of the photo is out of focus that you just get the circular blur of the lights and every other bit of detail in the back of the shot, meaning that you get a more interesting image. Play on the side of caution with this unless you really know what you're doing. So shoot with an aperture that's as wide as you can go on your lens, but also something that's going to give you enough depth of field to make sure that you get the right amount of focus on your image to make sure that the person or the model or the subject in the photo looks sharp. Also inside of your camera you have the dial which says AV, which is Aperture Priority mode. So this means you can set the aperture of your camera to be whatever you want it to be, let's say f3.5, and then whenever you you point the camera around is going to adjust the shutter speed or the ISO to be able to get the correct exposure. So if you're wanting a certain look where the background's as out of focus as it can be, you've got a really shallow depth of field on there, you will set your aperture to what the widest your lens will go, and then you can keep it at that. If you're trying to then say get a bit more in focus, and let's say you're trying to do like a nighttime shot and you're trying to get the perfect exposure straight away, you can set your aperture to be say f16, something like that. So you get a darker aperture, which means it's got to let more light in, which will mean it will open up the shutter longer to be able to let more light in. You shoot on aperture priority and you set your aperture to the widest it can be and allow your camera to go around and shoot. However, I would make sure and bear this in mind that you want to make sure you've got enough light or ambient light to be able to shoot regularly at that aperture. If you're trying to do it at too dark of an aperture and you're trying to get consistent shots and there's not enough light in there, you'll find that your camera will start doing all sorts of weird and wonderful things with real slow shutter speeds or the ISO going sky high, which then means that you've suddenly got loads of grain in your shots or they're just blurry. So just err on the side of caution with it. However, once again, it's a great tip that if you are in good light and you know that you want to get consistent shots and you don't want to be worrying about the shutter being 1,000th of a second or 8,000th of a second, let your camera do the hard work, turn and point it with the aperture locked in, and you can just get consistent shots that will always be exposed correctly. So that's another little tip that you can use that whilst you're learning to get into full manual mode.